Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of the Hen House at Home Fall Book Tour. I'm Monica Fernandez, the media manager of Red Hen Press.
And I am Tobi Harper, Deputy Director.
So we're so excited for tonight's event, which is featuring Jennifer Risher, the author of We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth, and some very special guests, which we'll introduce in just a second. But first, we wanted to celebrate the publication day of Amy Sherren's new novel, Unseen City, which is a multi-generational portrait of New York, part ghost story, part history lesson. And if you purchase a copy today, a portion of your purchase will be donated to the Weeksville Heritage Center in New York, a multidisciplinary museum dedicated to preserving the history of the 19th century African-American community of Weeksville, Brooklyn, one of America's many free Black communities. So get your copy today. And now for the main event, we're thrilled to feature a reading and conversation on wealth, philanthropy, and identity with Jennifer Risher, who will be joined by Denise Frost, the Senior Director of Major Gifts at Occidental College, and our very own Kate Gale. Welcome, all of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Looking forward to hearing this conversation. And me and Monica are going to go now, and we'll come say hi to you at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Denise, for being here with us. It was great meeting you last summer at Ghost Ranch. And thank you, Jennifer Risher, very much for joining us from San Francisco. We're so excited about your book here at Red Hen. This is your first book, and we'll be interested to see if you end up writing more books. So We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth by Jennifer Risher. Please let us know what this book is about, and we're looking forward to you reading to us a little bit from this very exciting book.
Great. Thank you, Kate. It's so nice to be here. So I'm really lucky. When I was 25, I joined Microsoft, and I met my husband, David, and I got these things that ended up being worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, these stock options. 6 years later, when David and I were married and expecting our first child, David took a job at a small, unknown startup that was selling books on the internet called Amazon.com. We were in our early 30s, the company went public, and we had more money than we could wrap our heads around. And wealth surprised me. You know, having a lot of money doesn't look or feel like what Hollywood sells us. I didn't find myself in a big, sparkly private club hanging out and sharing financial secrets. I found myself in a strange, silent space where no one was really talking much about money at all. Even though there were all these new challenges, no one was discussing their upset at a sibling's resentment, or their worry about raising spoiled, entitled children, or their own ambivalence. There were no dialogues about whether to give to family members or how to best approach philanthropy. Even though for most people, these challenges are new. 8 out of 10 people with wealth grew up middle class or poor. Now, it might be hard to imagine wealth as a challenge that needs to be overcome. And I really want to say up front that money makes life easier. No one needs to shed any tears over my situation. I'm very lucky. But wealth can be isolating. So normally, if I have a question or a problem, I turn to friends. Let's say I want to figure out, should our 16-year-old have a curfew? Well, I talk to everyone I know. I get their ideas, I hear their advice, I hear about their experiences, get different perspectives, and just talking is helpful. It lets me know that my question is normal, that it's valid and shared. But the same doesn't happen with money. And I couldn't talk to friends about having a lot of it. So I decided I'd turn to books, but there were no books. I wrote my book because my story is one I'd want to know about if it hadn't happened to me. I also wrote my book for the millions of Americans like me who have more money than they had growing up, or maybe have more money than others in their extended family, or more money than their friends. I'm telling my story to help other people understand their own. And my goal is not to show people how to do rich right. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm offering up a story that hasn't been told, that deals with things like how hard it can be to navigate a vacation with another family that doesn't share your resources, or how upsetting it is to feel a friend's jealousy and not be able to share what's going on in your life, or how painful it is to feel as though your parents disapprove of what you have. I want to validate these experiences, to demystify wealth, and to show us that we are all more alike than different. I also wrote my book to get us talking. Money is a taboo subject, but it doesn't have to be. And the more I've talked about money, the more I realize it's not money itself that we avoid. It's the emotions behind the money. And these emotions are universal. No matter how much you have in your bank account, think about it. If you have a parent, if you have a sibling, a friend, a partner, you probably know that it's uncomfortable to talk about money. Maybe you have an awkward money situation right now with someone close to you. We are afraid. We're afraid of hurting someone else's feelings. We're afraid of rejection. We're afraid we won't measure up or that we'll sound unknowledgeable. So we don't talk to each other. But I want to encourage us to talk, because we all have money shame, money guilt. All of us have a money story. And our money story starts in childhood. And my money story started in childhood. And I'll read you just briefly from the book about a little bit about my childhood and my parents' background. So while I was growing up, there had always been a rainy day lurking in the living room. My mother stuck closely to her grocery list, used the same tea bag for a second and third cup of tea, and only drove when necessary because gas was expensive. When my father sat at his desk, opening envelopes and paying bills and clouds of cigarette smoke, I tiptoed past. Finances made him grumpy. The oldest of five, my father had grown up in Middletown, New York, where he rushed to the dinner table to gulp down his food before someone else could claim it. His father had dropped out of school in 8th grade to work, and his mother was a 2nd grade teacher. The family didn't have much money. Although my grandfather worked his way up in a bank, eventually becoming branch president, my father continued to worry about getting enough to eat. Meanwhile, my mother, an only child, grew up upper middle class in Flint, Michigan. Her father was a prominent lawyer, her mother a volunteer on the local hospital board, and both were keenly aware of proper etiquette. They participated in theater group and bridge club and were careful to keep up appearances. When she was scrubbing the floor in a housecoat and curlers and a stranger rang the doorbell, my grandmother put on an accent and pretended to be the help. "The lady of the house isn't home," she said. So I'll talk briefly about philanthropy, and it's something we will discuss later on. And just as we have a money story that starts in childhood, I think our attitude towards charitable giving and philanthropy starts in childhood as well. And for me, when I was growing up, my mom and I took canned peaches to food drives, and we took clothes to the Goodwill. But I never experienced my parents making financial donations. It wasn't until I was working at Microsoft and surrounded by peers that were making charitable donations that I first gave a small percentage of my paycheck to United Way. And then, I started, the next sort of step was giving to places that had given to me. So I gave to NPR, I gave to the Mothers Group, the nonprofit that organized my Mothers Group. And it was at this time I wanted to start doing more. I felt a sense of responsibility and obligation. We had so much, and I wanted to give back. And it was a little overwhelming. I wasn't sure where to give, how to give. I felt like I needed to do the research. I needed to do it perfectly. I needed a philanthropic strategy and a plan. And it was all really quite overwhelming. And at this time, as I was trying to figure these things out, I remember driving off the highway and seeing a homeless man standing on the corner. And there were a long line of cars, and I was inching towards him. And as I got closer, I basically looked straight ahead, just kind of willing the car in front of me to move forward so I could make my turn. And as soon as I made the turn, I heard a voice. "Mom, why was that man standing there? Was he hungry? Did his sign say he was hungry? Did he want money? Do you have money? Why didn't you give him any money?" And these were very good questions. And just a couple days later, when Dave and I went out for dinner with another couple, I brought up this experience and we talked about it. And in that conversation, we all agreed that we needed to be more generous and that we challenged each other. Each of us was going to give away $1,000, $100 at a time. And I write about this experience in my book, and I'll read you briefly about just a little bit about that experience when we were giving away $100. The following week, with a $100 bill folded in the pocket of my dark purple coat, I walked into the dry cleaners to the sound of the bell and the smell of hot wool. After paying and picking up the clothes, hardly noticing the metal hangers digging into my palm or worrying about the dangers of plastic bags, I focused all my energy on getting the timing right. "Happy holidays," I practically shouted, handing the woman $100. After years of greetings and pleasantries, it was as though the two of us saw each other for the first time. We smiled. I stared. She nodded. "Thank you very much," she said. "You're welcome," I said. "Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come in here." And then I scurried out the door. That evening, when I told David about the experience, his face contorted. "I gave away some money today too," he said. "You know the woman at Starbucks? The one who makes great latte foam?" I asked. "You gave her $100? "I did," he said, "but well, I went in there planning to tell her what a great barista she was, but there was a long line, so I waited around." "Did she notice you?" "I'm sure she did. I was hanging out looking at espresso machines for quite a long time. Finally, I got a coffee as an excuse to talk to her, but it was like a comedy. Just as I got to the counter, she went over to arrange things on the shelves." "What did you do?" "It was so awkward. Why didn't you just leave?" "I should have, but I was determined. I went over and let her know that we thought she was a great barista and handed her $100. But she refused to take it." "Oh no." "Yeah, it was bad," he said, beginning to laugh. "And it got worse. I didn't give up. I insisted. Finally, she told me to put the money in the tip jar." "Did you?" "Yes," and then ran out of the store. Several weeks later, David had more success. On our way to Napa, we stopped at an In-N-Out burger. David placed our order, and Emily and Allie and I found a table, arranged napkins, ready for our meal. Suddenly, David was standing by my side, asking for one of our special bills. I handed him $100 and watched him hurry back to the counter, where he stopped in front of a young couple. He said something to the woman, then handed her the bill. She covered her mouth and began hopping up and down, while the man pumped David's hand, a huge smile on his face. "When I was paying for the food, I needed 10 cents, David told me when he returned to the table. I was fishing around in my pocket trying to come up with a change, and that guy gave me a dime." "And you gave him $100? "That's right. Did you see his reaction?" "He looked ecstatic," I said. "He looked the way this makes me feel." I had no idea what $100 meant to the couple or what they would do with the money, but I felt connected to them, our lives touching for a warm, happy moment. The element of surprise was joyous too. Whether a dime, $1, or $100, being charitable is not about amounts or philanthropic strategy, but about opening our hearts and doing our personal best to make a positive difference in one another's lives. Thank you.
Well, that was great. I love hearing all these different stories from the book, because it reminds me, of course, of when I first read the book and fell in love with it. So one of the themes I think of this evening will be finding how much we all have in common. And when I first read your book, what I found was how much you and I had in common, which of course, I think most people would think that we wouldn't have had much in common. But one thing, of course, was that we both were interested in literacy. You and your husband run World Reader, which is a big literacy project, and I run a very small literacy project here in Los Angeles called Writing in the Schools, which Red Hen runs. But Red Hen itself is obviously very interested in getting books out into the world. The other thing that it made me think about, though, was that when Mark and I met, our love story had also centered around books. The big story that we both told each other was that we had both been very poor when we met each other. When we had grown up, we'd both been very poor. I had grown up in a cult, and then I was on my own, and he was also abandoned by his parents. And so we had both ended up at some point living in our car, and in our car, we had built a little bookshelf. And on the bookshelf, we'd had a few of our favorite books. And so one of the things that I thought about when I'd first read your book was that if you had told me when I was living in that car, if you told him when he was living in that car with a little bookshelf, that at some point we would have a house and we'd be living in a house with lots of books, like the books I have behind me. This is actually, I am in my own house with my own books right now. I wouldn't have believed it. And so in a way, all of us who have great changes that happen in our life, obviously I have no stock options. I have no stocks at all. When the stock market goes up and down, it does not affect me at all. But still, I've come a long way from living in the car with my little bookshelf in the car. And so I think that for all of us who have had great changes happen in our life, we feel surprised by those changes. And we feel, and we also feel often like, what do we do with, how do we live differently with our money? Sometimes when I'm at the grocery store, I'm kind of surprised that I can just willy-nilly put things into my cart. And because I remember, having $20 when I went to the grocery store. And so when I was reading your book for the first time, I was fascinated by all the things that we had in common, and I was also really fascinated by the whole idea of how hard it is to talk about money. One of the conversations that my husband and I ended up having because of your book was we realized that we both had mad money hidden around the house in different places in case of like earthquake or fire. We had to just grab cash and run, but we didn't know where the other person's mad money was. And it wasn't like we were trying to keep it a secret. It's just like we'd never mentioned it. And so at some point I said to him, I think we should probably tell each other where we're keeping our mad money. This is so weird. So last week we told each other. Because of your book. So I wanted to ask you, or maybe we could just discuss a little bit when you've already been out in the world with this book for a few weeks now, having conversations with people, and I know everybody now has their own money story to come up to you with, and share with you these stories of their own money stories. How does that feel to you to find out that everybody has their own difficulties with talking about money, either with their kids or with their spouses or with their parents and that kind of thing?
Well, I kind of knew this all along, that that I wasn't really the only one, that I just wasn't talking to other people. And actually, right towards the end of my writing process, I interviewed those 11 women. And it was at that moment when I thought, okay, I want to include different voices and different perspectives. And just thinking about asking people to talk to me about their experience with wealth, it made me so nervous. I mean, I almost couldn't do it. It was so uncomfortable. So I really had to push through discomfort just to send a couple of emails to a couple acquaintances. And when I did that, the response was amazing. I mean, people wrote me back and said, I think about these things all the time, but I never discuss them. And when we got together, it was so validating and comforting to hear. We could talk about our kids, about our parents, about feelings of isolation. We had so much in common, and, we weren't alone. So that was really, really wonderful to kind of confirm. And what happened is, after I talked to one person, she'd say, oh, you've got to talk to so-and-so. You've got to talk. And so I kind of was led organically to talk to people that I really was like many degrees separated from, that I didn't know. And that was wonderful. And now that the book is out, I've received so many amazing notes and letters with people saying, thanking me for writing the book, for talking about something that really no one discusses, and yet is so important for us to talk about on every level, no matter how much or how little you have. I think money can loom larger than us, but we can put it in its place if we connect and talk to each other. Right.
Well, I think that leads into what I was going to talk to you a little bit about. First, I love the book, and I found it really relatable. I grew up with, my dad was a football coach, and he had a very strange relationship to money, very emotional. And so I think my goal was not to have the emotion attached to money in the same way. I found your statement and your thesis of the book to be very fascinating. And I think you've pointed out that men talk more openly about money, about their salaries, their stock options. And that starts, I think, at a younger age and at work. So I'm wondering, women seem to still find that taboo. And do you think that's changing? And if not, how do you think we can start changing that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think when I think of my parents, like the generation before me, it was certainly very true. I mean, even in our family, my dad handled the finances. My mom, didn't know anything about money. And she told me, actually, her parents, so my grandparents, my grandfather didn't want my grandmother to work. Like, women, it was a luxury not to work, and women weren't supposed to be in the workforce. So, it's changed, luckily, to now that women are in the workforce. But the whole idea of talking about money, I think men do brag about their bonuses and compare notes and identify more with their money. They are investing more. They're more active with their money. And I think women miss out. And I read a recent study where it does start. And even today in our houses, we are teaching our boys about, budgeting and banking and investing. We're not teaching our girls those same skills. And that handicaps us as women when we can't talk about something. And at the same time, we women are the ones that we're communicators, right? Like, we need to be out talking about it. So I'm actually hoping that my book can help change that we can take control of our own feelings around money. And when things come up, we can talk to each other about it. And we don't have that muscle built yet. We don't have a formula, or we don't have a way to do it. So it isn't easy. And I think it means being uncomfortable, but I think it's a requirement that we kind of push through that and talk to each other.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting when women talk about money. Even in Hollywood, that's how we found out that men were like paid in some cases twice as much as a woman on a movie. And I think that sometimes it holds us back as salaries. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
I think that leads into the whole idea. Both Denise and I work in fundraising, and one of the questions when you're working in fundraising is who's making the decisions about philanthropy in a couple. And in your book, you talk about how your husband and you make decisions together. But do you think that often in couples, one person makes the decision more than the other? And do you think that tends to be gender balanced? Denise and I have talked a little bit about how I think a lot of people who are working in fundraising have a tendency to go toward either the man or the woman, depending on sort of who maybe they're more comfortable with asking for money. But who do you think is more of the driver when it comes to philanthropy in most couples?
Well, I did look that up, and I saw that 97% of women are more likely, women of high net worth are giving, whereas 87% of men are. So I think it is a little bit more driven. And that article kind of said, yeah, it's because we have empathy more than men. I don't know if any men listening here will agree, but I think there's some sense of empathy that kind of drives us to be more philanthropic. But at the same time, I do think couples make decisions together, and I'm basing that on my husband. So he has a nonprofit that he started 10 years ago. And so he's been doing a lot of fundraising, and he's worked with a lot of different people kind of as he's raised money. And he says, if it's a larger gift, it definitely, he can talk to one in the couple, but then there's always the well, let me get back to you after I talk to my spouse. And it really is about getting that spouse as engaged as the person he originally talked to. And in some cases, he does have a relationship with each person. In some, he has a relationship with one, but he knows that spouse is a critical piece to getting, buy-in on giving. And when I think about it, it's like, wow, it's a great opportunity, again, to have a good conversation with your partner, right? Here's a chance to talk about money and about your values, because, giving is very expressive. It's very personal. Like, what do you care about? Where do you want to feel like you've made an impact? And whether it is, a smaller $10 gift or a gift of your time, like where does your heart go? So talking about that as a couple, I think is important.
Well, that kind of leads into our next question, and I think your approach to this is really interesting. How do we teach our children or the next generation to be philanthropic? It's interesting you're talking about your spouse, but is this sort of like how you bring your family into it also? So I'd like to hear how you approach that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have certain structures in place to kind of teach their kids, or they give kids money to then give to an organization that they like. We didn't really do that. It was more rather than kind of telling them, saving, spending, giving. We kind of led by example. I think, the way, it kind of piggybacks with the idea of like, how do you keep your kids from being spoiled? And in both cases, it's really showing them your values and living your values. So, our sense was like, we want to live our values. We want to live giving. And so our kids have, they've been with us when we visited World Reader schools. They've been in the classroom with us. They've read with the kids. They've seen the teachers' excitement at, having digital books in their classroom. They've traveled with us to China, where we worked together in the school and taught kindergarten together for 2 weeks. When we donated a house to a family in Vietnam, we all went there together and we painted the house and we had lunch with the family. And just that kind of exposure, we're very fortunate to have that. But I think having them join us in those types of activities. And then, I think you teach your kids day to day too, like going into the grocery store, like what do you do when someone cuts you off and parks in front of you? How do you react? Like, when you walk into the grocery store, how do you make your decisions? Are you making choices? Do they see you weighing things and talking about the quality or the prices? How do they see you interacting with the guy in the meat counter? Are you saying thank you? Are you respectful? Are you generous with the person who is checking you out? And with other people in the store? Do you return the cart? I mean, they watch all these things, right? So I think it's really living by example and making sure that you are living your own values, and kids pick up on that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, I remember a friend said, how do you keep from buying your kids all these toys? Why don't you just buy them? And my answer to that is, we have to say no. That's one of the things us parents have to learn to do. And just the fact that you can afford something doesn't mean that that's something you value.
Right.
So that's a thing. And people would say, oh, you're traveling so much with your kids. Aren't they going to be jaded? And I'm like, I'm not jaded. I'm still very grateful. I think it's about your values, but it's also about your attitude.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Several philanthropists I've dealt with and worked with, they're so modest, and they actually don't want things named after them. They actually say things like, I want to do what's right. And I think that's a really, hard thing to do in all levels of your life. But I always admire that. It's something that we need to always think about.
It's interesting, that whole, I've been asked that question of like, should people give anonymously or not? And I think it's a little bit old thinking. Like, it used to be like, oh, the rich person's going to put their name on the building and they're going to brag about this. I think, and I guess this kind of goes to say, we need to talk. I think we should say, I, Jennifer Risher, am giving this amount, because it is letting the world know that this is something I care about. It's letting my peers know that I'm giving. And I think we need to have more conversations with each other about giving. Like, I think there's this misperception that, everyone who has a lot of money is all connected to each other and we're all talking to each other. And we're not. And that's the reason I wrote the book. We're not talking to each other. And how can we be really great philanthropists if we're just doing it on our own, solo, and not even sharing our names? I think the more we can kind of share with each other, really the better, because then we can collaborate. We learn from each other. I mean, it's like anything else. When we're in community with people, so many better ideas come up. Like, if you're just sitting in a room thinking by yourself or talking to your partner, that's one thing. But if you're in a conversation with a larger group of people, you're probably going to do a better job at figuring out how to give and do it right, and ratchet it up too.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to be like Eli Broad, and I think Eli Broad's done a wonderful job in the city of Los Angeles. So I give him a lot of credit, but I don't think you have to be at that level of giving and that level of having your name on buildings. But I just remember the first time Red Hen had like 5 of their major donors at a dinner, and they were all talking with each other. And I just remember thinking, this is so great, because they're all talking about different things they had been asking us to do. And suddenly it was just like, yeah, we all would love to see Red Hen get to this level. And we finally had some sort of coherence in the room. And they were just all having a great conversation. They got to know each other. They liked each other. There is something about having these, and they knew each other. And I don't know, I think there's something about having donors acknowledge each other and know each other that can be really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, giving is part of it. You're in a relationship. So not only do they know each other, they all know you. And then they want to, we give to people, not organizations. Right. So a lot of times, Kate, I think people give to you, right. They respect you. They know what you're doing. They want to help you. And then, yeah, if they're all together, it just kind of forms more of a community feel, which is really nice.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think also this leading, I know that Kate's going to talk about this a little bit, but I think where I work too, it's really important when somebody's peer or a volunteer can just show their passion for something, because I think that in a lot of ways resonates as much or more than when it's a staff member asking. So I think it's really important. And we're in the middle of a campaign right now. And you can just see that when somebody steps up and says, this is important to me. And, we're lucky because we work at a college where we have a lot of students. So we need a lot of scholarship. And so it is meaningful, and you can see that. And when somebody who's your peer talks about that, I think it really resonates.
Right. Yeah. And having that whole group of donors all be excited together was just kind of like, you stole my heart. So another thing we were Denise and I were talking about, Jennifer, was this whole idea of and that I know World Reader has done so successfully of having volunteers and mentors who get excited about the work that you're doing, and then some of them end up giving back to the organization. So I know you've taken some of your volunteers to see some of the great work you've been doing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it is really wonderful when people can feel and experience kind of what's going on the ground. We were in Nairobi in Kenya, and we did a reading summit with a lot of the people who were already donors, but you bring donors who already love the organization, and then they see it and they experience it. They're talking to people who have been impacted by it. Actually, a great story, we were staying in a hotel, and one of the waiters came up to one of the donors, and she had a World Reader logo, and she's like, "Hey, what's that? I was involved in World Reader when I was in school. It helped me get to college." And he told his whole story of how reading had really opened up his world. And I mean, wow, what a better experience for a donor than to have that like real impact right there in the form of a real person who had been affected and positively changed. It changed his life. So it's super exciting. Yeah. And we spent time in India at schools there, and seeing the kids, seeing the teachers, the excitement. I mean, education is so important. I mean, people say this is their way out of poverty, and reading is such a necessity if you want to live a prosperous life. And so it's just so positive to see, these programs in action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's.
And I actually think, you sort of asked like about, volunteering places, and I was thinking about this. So one of the organizations I really love is Girls on the Run. And it's an organization that I became a coach for Girls on the Run. And so I had a group of girls that I met with every Thursday for, a couple of 3 months, I guess. And it was an amazing experience. They're all fifth grade girls. Tough. This is really tough. And it made me really appreciate teachers so much more. I'm not sure I was a great coach, but I loved the program. Some of the girls were the sweetest things. And I just believed in the program so much that I've continued to be give to that program, especially because I was involved in it.
Right.
Yeah,
there's something about participating in an art form or a program. I mean, every time I go to the LA Master Chorale and I sing the Hallelujah chorus, I'm thinking I'm kind of a singer too, although pretty much nobody in my row thinks that about me except me. But it feels like I'm part of this art form as well, and there's just nothing like being part of something that makes you want to give. And so we also have people who mentor Red Hen and volunteer at Red Hen who get excited about what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So Denise, you had something.
Well, it sounds like I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you. So do you have a personal story of how your philanthropy and seeing the impact of your philanthropy has affected your giving? And it sounds like Girls on the Run is a perfect example. But also, I think it's interesting that a lot of us start giving either in church or through schools. like our children are involved in. So just kind of wanted to hear a little bit about.
Yeah, I think that's true, actually. Yeah, with religious organizations or with schools, and it was our daughter's school that really started me thinking. And they asked me for a large amount of money when our girls were really young, and that shocked me. But it got me thinking bigger, and so it sort of prompted me to expand my thinking and my giving. And after that time when I really was trying to figure it all out and kind of come up with a great strategy, I've really just given really where I feel like there's been a need in my immediate community. I mean, we live in California, so there's often a need in the Hispanic community. So I've given to the Family Center in Napa, and there's I'm a tennis lover, so there's a coach that started this great organization that does tennis border exchange. So he's down at the Arizona Mexico border, kind of teaching kids from Mexico as well as from the United States, and having that exchange, the cultural exchange, along with tennis. So my giving has really been, I followed my heart, and I think that is important, because that's what's going to spur you to give more and to get involved. And then that's where it really feels much more meaningful and impactful when your whole body is involved in giving. And certainly that's true of World Reader and the work my husband's been doing. I mean, he's dedicated his life to World Reader and has 15 million kids reading in his program. So he's making a big difference in the world, and that it feels great. And he lives and breathes it every day. I could also talk. I mean, I feel like I could talk forever about this, because my book was supposed to come out in May, and of course we all know that the world was upside down. And when it wasn't coming out, and my husband and I were sitting around, it was actually in April with COVID, and his organization the funding was sort of drying up, and he wasn't sure kind of how World Reader was going to fare through this time, and all nonprofits. I mean, we're suffering, and I read hands nodding, because it was tough. Like, you weren't sure, you couldn't have your volunteers come in, you couldn't run your luncheons, you couldn't do your gala, you couldn't raise money, and yet the need was so great. And my husband and I really wanted to give to nonprofits and really, really branch out, not only to ones that we were already giving to, but to all nonprofits. And so instead of just us giving, we kind of started this challenge to get others to join us. And we ran it's called the Half My DAF challenge. And it got people inspired to give from a donor advised fund, which just briefly is like a charitable checking account. You get your tax break up front, you put it in this donor advised fund, and then you write checks. But the money was sort of stuck there, and we wanted to encourage people to move that money out. And we put up $1 million in the form of matching grants to nonprofits. Any nonprofit that anyone wanted to support, they'd be eligible for a match if the donors committed to spending out half the money in their donor advised fund. And we've now moved over $7 million, and we've worked closely with nonprofits. It's built a real community. And when you get back to talking about things, donors have come to us and said, this is the nudge we needed. We're sitting around the dinner table talking with our adult kids about where to give. We've just had an outpouring of gratitude from donors to actually give. And you realize, giving is really powerful, and it's really joyous. And people are thanking us for helping nudge them to do that. So that's been really wonderful. In fact, tomorrow we will be giving away matching grants to the nonprofits that are on our website. So we get to give away all sorts of money tomorrow, which will be really, really fun.
Well, that's exciting. And I want to thank you for Occidental College, because it's how it started our conversation too. And, it's so amazing when you think about how much money is sitting in the donor advised funds. And it's I think, made the nonprofits start to really try to think, well, who's got the donor advised fund? Who's told us about it? And this is the time, whether it's a nonprofit that's, an arts organization or anything, this is the time to give, because we don't know how long this is going to last. So I think that's a really great movement you started, and I think everyone in the nonprofit world is talking about it. So it was really exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, like we, in March and April, the big question was just sort of which nonprofits were going to survive, and also at the university level, which private universities were going to survive. I mean, I don't know if there was question about whether state universities would survive, because I didn't really hear about state universities closing down, but I know there was conversation about whether private universities would survive. And certainly in the nonprofit world, there was a question of whether or not nonprofits would survive. And at the same time, you could just Google how much money was sitting around in donor advised funds and realize there was just massive amounts of money that is just there. And that some of your donors have money there, and they've just have it sitting there, and it's very frustrating. And so, I feel like you started a really great conversation. I hope everybody that's listening to this is paying attention to this part of this, because, I think that even if they don't participate in this challenge, that the Half My DAF challenge that you're talking about, I think it's a great time, if people want arts organizations to survive, to write checks out of those donor advised funds to help nonprofits to survive, because this is a dark kind of window of the soul here for those of us who are in the nonprofit world. And just like, if we're going to stay whole through this, it would be great if some of that DAF money were broken loose. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to let Denise finish this off. When, for everyone watching this who has ever worked in fundraising, one of the things we always talk about is the whole idea of, I don't like to use the word stewardship, because it's such a big, kind of word that, like, what is it really talking about? But really what we're talking about is, when we receive support from a foundation or a donor, I think that what we know we're supposed to do is come back to that donor or foundation and do a very good job of telling the story of what we did with that money. And first of all, thanking them, but then also doing a very good job of telling the story. And the thing is, if I'm going to guess that Occidental College does a pretty good job of that, because they have an advancement team. They've got a whole team of people that are working around the clock to make sure that all of that is done. But for all of my friends who work at small to medium organizations like Red Hen, where the advancement team is, well, wait a minute, everybody in the advancement team is sitting on this couch. It's harder to think about whether or not you're actually doing everything you should be doing on that list, which is thank the person or foundation, and then give a good accounting of how you have spent that money and how that has changed your organization. And I feel like a better way of thinking about it, rather than filling out big reports and everything, is that what people really want is to hear the story of how your organization has been changed. That it's much more storytelling that people want than just filling in little reports. Obviously you guys are also filling in those kinds of, are also talking with donors at World Reader. How would you respond to that yourselves?
Yeah, I think everyone's different. Some people want a note of thanks and that's it. Some people really want to spend time with you on the phone. They want to hear the stories. It really is like, it's a relationship. So your relationship with each donor is going to be a little bit different. And it's kind of, I think it really is getting to know each of your donors as much as you can. I mean, some people are happy to write a check. They don't want to be bothered for another year. Other people want to check in. They want to hear from you. I would say, you know, everyone likes to feel appreciated. So I think that's a really key piece of good stewardship, is making sure that your donors know that you appreciate them. And I think that if you feel appreciated and you feel like you've made an impact and you've had a difference, I mean, that's a great feeling, and it keeps you coming back for more.
Yeah. Denise?
So I love the story in your book about the fact that you always wanted to travel as a family, because when you were a child, you had an overseas experience, or you lived outside of the United States. So you actually made that happen for a number of years, and that sort of led you through your travels to what World Reader is and what that idea is. So my sense is that your larger philanthropy is not transactional, but really a quest to be transformational. So I just want to hear a little bit about that and your philosophy for philanthropy.
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, and I've had a question similar to that, sort of like, how do you use wealth for good? And I've thought a lot about that, and I think it's really, each of us should ask ourselves the question, how are we using our lives for good? So you don't have to have a lot of money to be, you know, a philanthropist. I mean, or to be giving, or to be generous with your time, with your, you know, affection, with your, you know, dedication, or your skills. I think we can all, you know, give to each other. And so when I think about philanthropy, I mean, David's dedicated his time to creating this, you know, nonprofit, and he loves the challenge, and he loves to see the impact. I've spent a lot of time with this book, and I'm hoping really, you know, that my book becomes a catalyst for conversation that really does help us on an individual level kind of talk to each other about money, but also at a bigger level. I mean, it may sound far-reaching, but I hope that my book can help fight income inequality. I mean, there's a lot of suffering right now in our country, with, you know, people going without housing, without health care, without food. There's an education crisis. And, you know, our silence has a lot of power. It keeps the status quo in place. And when we're silent, we're not examining our relationship with money. We can stay in our bubble and be unaware. And I think it's really important for us to shine a light on our lives and on situation. And, you know, when there's a large and influential segment of the population that feels isolated and estranged, and they're not talking to each other, they're probably not at their most generous or empathetic, and they're probably not holding themselves accountable. So I'm hoping really to help conversations start that aren't happening now, that can really kind of make a big difference. So I'm hoping that my book helps with philanthropy and with families and with friends. I mean, this is something you can read with your parent and have a conversation. I've included questions at the end of every chapter that help prompt conversations. I mean, this isn't easy. I'm inviting people to get uncomfortable. It's not easy to talk about money. And when we don't talk about it, it tends to loom large and take on a life of its own. And I'd hope we can help put money in its place, not as something that's bigger than us, but that is a tool that we can use.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear this conversation. This was I mean, obviously, Jen, I've gotten to hear you talk about this a lot, but I feel like I've heard even more today than I've gotten to before. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Denise, for your expertise. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then, of course, Kate, for your stories, as always, for moderating the story. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you guys so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course, he's in. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us for today's event, learning about how we need to talk about wealth. I know I have learned a lot. I've started talking with my own friends about wealth, or well, lack thereof, but also donating anyway, because I do have enough, and I can give. And talking to my friends and inviting them to give where they can. I think it's been very helpful. It's been really great for me. So please tune in next week. Next week, we're going to be hearing from Melanie Conroy Goldman of The Likely World, and From Unseen City by Amy Shern. Thank you so much. Hope to see you next week. And thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.